Civil War Trails has been working with communities since 1994 to share their stories and connect visitors with small towns and big stories across a network that now spans 6 states. Travelers look to trails to put them in the footsteps of the generals, soldiers, citizens, and the enslaved who found themselves in the midst of this Civil War.
So this weekend we decided to take a tour of Civil War Trail stops across Northern Virginia and Central Virginia. And the video is going to end up being kind of a mixed match of different Civil War stops along the way. And hopefully you can get something out of this video. We're out here at a Civil War Trail stop in Northern Virginia at a place called Sterling Plantation. Now directly across the street here is where that plantation house still sits today. The reason why this is a significant location isn't necessarily anything that happened there at the plantation, other than the fact that it is a Civil War witness, if you will. It's that road that lies right there in front of it. Now, this road, May 21st of 1864, General Grant and his Union Army came down this route as they were headed towards Guinea Station, and this was after Spotsylvania. Also, this route is significant for General Jackson. During the fight where General Jackson was wounded, he was taking this route all the way to Guinea Station, where he'd eventually end up at the Chandler home and would rest up and try to recuperate there. That would be the place where General Jackson would die. Jed Hotchkiss would write about the ride along the way, talking about meeting many soldiers along the way that were wounded, that were heading in the same direction from the Confederate Army. And they're all wishing them well and wishing that they were the ones that were severely wounded and not General Jackson. But obviously we all know how history turned out for that one. General Jackson dies at Guinea Station. And General Grant, in 1864, just a year later, continues his march and pushing down towards Richmond, Virginia. Some pretty historic and significant things to happen out here in just one stop on the Civil War trails. Another Civil War Trail stop along the way is the Massaponax Church. Now, May 21st, 1864, at about 10 a.m., this church becomes the subject of a series of photographs that are taken out here by Timothy O'Sullivan. The 114th Pennsylvania is sitting right out front here, directly behind me in front of this church. Now, the 114th Pennsylvania is known for being part of the group of soldiers that are with the generals that are headquartered together. When Timothy O'Sullivan catches up with the group out here, he captures a series of photographs that are pretty significant, and it captures Grant and his leadership having a conference here directly out in front of this church. It was a real significant photo snap of what happens during a campaign. Something that really, there's not too many photographs like that. There was photographs taken of Grant in other locations where he's conferencing with soldiers, but this one is real significant. You can clearly see Grant in the photograph. You can clearly see his staff and his leadership in the photograph, sitting on benches that had been taken out of this church and placed underneath a tree right out here on the grounds at Massaponax Church in Virginia. This is pretty neat. and it's out here on the Civil War trails. We're now at a location that in August of 1862, the American Civil War came to its front doorstep. And this place was not more than just a couple of buildings and a county courthouse. Where we're at now is Spotsylvania Courthouse. The courthouse itself still stands right behind me, along with several buildings that are out here, including the old Tavern and a few other buildings that are out here. There are several Civil War trail markers out here that indicate the history, that talk about the history that happened out here at Spotsylvania. Now, in August of 1862, this place first had its taste with the Civil War when it was raided. Soldiers came into town and took just about everything that wasn't buttoned down to the floor. Then 9 months later, the Battle of Chancellorsville took place, and there was another situation where, troop after troop was being brought over here for capture. Federal troops were being held here as prisoners of war, and Confederate troops are being brought back here as casualties. Then the Battle of Spotsylvania happens, and this courthouse comes under direct fire. This whole town does. And this very small village that one man from 126 Pennsylvania described as not really a town, as one courthouse and a few small houses and a couple of churches out here, becomes the center of attention during the 1864 campaign, where General Grant is leading General Lee along and trying to get to Richmond and trying to really essentially capture the Army of Northern Virginia. So you can say this town, it went through it. Many of the towns in Virginia did, but for such a small place with only just a few buildings, it's pretty amazing what the town of Spotsylvania had to endure at that time. And still yet, historic buildings still exist today for you to come out here and check out. And can you imagine being a person that lives in a tiny little village or town like this back in 1862, where the roads are made of dirt and the fields are just simply farms and cows, and then a war machine rolls through your town and starts destroying everything? That's exactly what happens here. And not only that, dead and dying men are all about the grounds here at the courthouse. You have prisoners of war being shipped off to prison camps where they may or may not return from. It was a desperate scene out here. And these roads were heavily traveled by both armies, both north and south, going to and from different locations. And it was very significant ground during 1864, during that campaign that would lead to the ultimate victory for the United States Army at Appomattox. So we're out here at another Civil War trail site, and this is the location where the attack on Heth Salient took place at Spotsylvania Courthouse battle. Now, this isn't the national park land. This is a roadside exhibit that Civil War Trails has put up out here to give more of a description of what took place out here. Now, through the land where I'm at right now and across the street at the Wawa station, if you will, the Confederates actually counterattacked the Federal soldiers that were coming through here, and Burnside was in charge of the attack on Heth Salient, or Heth Salient. It did not work. They were repulsed and brought back through here. And unfortunately for the Union Army during that attack, we're talking some 9,000 soldiers that were killed or wounded out here during the attack that also encompassed the Mule Shoe Salient. Spotsylvania was a very bloody fight out here. And the early morning attack looked like it was going the way that the Federals wanted it to go. And it did push Confederates back in certain areas, but it did not push them away from Spotsylvania. Eventually, Grant realized that he needed to move out of his trenches and move on to another location, which is what he did May 21st of 1864, when his soldiers left their trenches and headed off east in that direction just in front of me towards the next destination. Many times you'll see me go out to national cemeteries because I like going out and learning about the soldiers that fought and died in and around these national battlefields. And I like to go out there and just reflect on how fragile life is. Well, today I'm not at a national cemetery. I'm at a Confederate cemetery. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but after the American Civil War was over with, the federal government came up with a nice plan for the Union dead. The plan was to spend thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars to go to battlefields and locations where these men had died, find their bodies on the fields of battle, and give them a suitable place to be buried and honored for their sacrifices in the name of the Union. But they did not come up with any kind of a plan for the Confederate soldiers because Confederate soldiers were considered treasonous. They were not considered part of the United States because they fought for the Confederacy, which makes them part of I guess a different country, even though they were still considered countrymen. So throughout the South, this place was ravaged by war. Now you have to understand that during the American Civil War, the majority of towns in the North, outside of places like Antietam, Chambersburg, and Gettysburg, the majority of those places had never seen a single shot fired in anger. They had never seen war, death, and destruction come to their doorsteps. They'd never seen what it looks like when an entire town is destroyed by cannon fire and littered by thousands of wounded, dead, and dying people. But the vast majority of southern towns, especially in Virginia, had seen that for years. And after the war was over with in 1865, the plan for Reconstruction did not have very much in it for reconstructing the towns. It was left up to the townspeople to figure out what they were going to do with their lives. One of the biggest things that they wanted to concentrate on was what to do with the dead, because farmers would plow the fields and bones would pop up, and they knew it was soldiers that had died, some blue, some gray. The blue would be interred in a national cemetery somewhere in an unknown marked grave, and the gray, on the other hand, would not have a place to go, especially if the families didn't know where they died. Well, a lot of ladies' units came together and they started gathering funds and scraping together as much as they could and finding pieces of land and building these cemeteries for the Confederate soldiers too. And they placed them in their own form of a national cemetery, if you will. So that's where I'm at right now. I'm at a Confederate cemetery where the soldiers that are out here are all Confederate soldiers. And this is just adjacent to that crossroad over there for Spotsylvania Courthouse, where the biggest portion of the fighting happened. The Mule Shoe Salient is only about 1.5 miles in that direction. Some of the worst fighting happened over this hill on that national battlefield that's over there. And they buried about 755 soldiers out here. And astonishingly, a lot of soldiers are actually identified out here. There are many of them that are not. But this is one of those places that was erected shortly after the American Civil War, along with the monument behind me and a lot of these headstones that were placed in here. Now, oddly enough, when this first started, many of the graves were marked with just wooden flat tablets, if you will, with unknown on it, or maybe an inscription of a name or something like that. But eventually those wooden placards would be replaced with actual stones to properly mark the grave sites. Some of the townspeople are actually buried out here in this cemetery as well. But it's kind of a off to itself sort of thing. And there's really not much you can say about that, other than it's a very peaceful place for these soldiers to be buried at. No matter how you feel about it, somebody in and around these towns lost someone that they cared about. And regardless of who they fought for, that is a very human thing to want to take care of the person that was related to you. I mean, these people out here that died, they weren't just Confederate soldiers, after all. At one point in time, they were Americans, part of the United States, and they were fathers and sons, cousins and uncles, nephews. They were related to another American who had to go on with the rest of their lives in the United States as good citizens after the American Civil War. So it's another thing to reflect on in this Civil War. It's another thing to think about. It's a very, very complicated subject. I'm at the next Civil War Trails battlefield stop, and it's Harris Farm out here at Spotsylvania. Out at this location, on May 19th of 1864, Ewell ends up sending the majority of his corps, which was only about 6,000 soldiers, out here to fight. The reason why was he was trying to protect the route that Lee knew that Grant was about to take, trying to flush out the Confederates from their trenches. Out here on this property there is a monument and there's a couple of markers. And the Civil War trails have put their signs up here to kind of give you a direction as to what happened in this location. There's also a portion of the earthworks or the trenches that were in place out here. Today, currently, it's a lot of large, wealthy houses that are out here. The majority of the battlefield has been destroyed by people putting their houses up. A lot of the properties that are out here have really taken over what was left of the battlefield. But it's still a nice stop along the Civil War trails if you get the chance to come out here. Now I'm roughly in the location where Harris Farm would have been. You can imagine the farm would probably be a very large piece of land and a house on it out here. Currently today there is a monument that was dedicated to Massachusetts because out here, this fight that took place, Massachusetts, Maine, and New York were all a part of the fight out here when Ewell brought his men across these fields and pushed those initial soldiers that were untested back. Some of the soldiers that were out here fighting for the United States Army were untested. They were fresh to fighting because they were in the Washington, D.C. defenses just a few days before this fight took place. And then immediately they are out here marching and pushing their way across these fields, and they're slammed right into by Ewell and his corps. Ewell's men are no stranger to the fight. They've been fighting for a very long time, and even though there's not as many of them as there were before, they still have the same tenacity and fighting spirit in them that they've had. But these places are not saved simply because somebody gets an idea and says, hey, let's go take care of it. They're saved because of people like American Battlefield Trust, the Civil War Trails placing their signs up to show these significant pieces of property, and CVBT, Central Virginia Battlefield Trust. They have a website out there that you can go to and check out some of the pieces of property in Central Virginia that they've saved from development, and even small tracts of land like this that are saved still hold significance. You can't imagine what the battlefield looks like today because of all of these ginormous multi-million-dollar houses that are around here. But they still saved one small patch of significant land from being developed, and that is important when it comes to history. And this monument will stand here as a testament to Massachusetts for the rest of the time. A lot of us never stop and think about what the passage of time is going to look like for us in the future. You know, we think that it's kind of almost like a never-ending thing until we get to a certain age, and then we start to realize that things will change and we will not exist. And unfortunately, for historians, we see a lot of that when it comes to these historical sites. We want these things to last forever so that people can learn from them. But unfortunately, development and modern housing and businesses are placed right on top of very historic sites. Kind of like where we're at today at the Harris Farm in Spotsylvania. Many of these houses probably could have been built anywhere out here on any other farmland that would have been less significant, but here they are today, as grand as ever, built on top of a battlefield that holds a lot of significance. But thankfully, Civil War Trails has placed a sign out here so people can still stop and learn. So come out and check it out for yourself. In the spring of 1862, shots rang out from that house right there. Now that house was known as Monsieur Conway's boyhood home. It's where the man had lived. The soldiers passing by were Union soldiers. They didn't know who lived in that house. All they knew was someone was trying to take one of their lives. So they decided that they were going to ransack that house and burn it to the ground. They kicked the door down and they got inside. And then they saw a portrait on the wall. Somebody recognized that portrait as Monsieur Conway. Now Monsieur was an abolitionist. And even one of the enslaved people that lived out here also said the same thing. That Monsieur was one of the biggest abolitionists in the area. Please don't burn down his house. So they didn't. They decided instead that they were going to turn this house into a hospital. And throughout the conflict here at Falmouth, near Falmouth and Fredericksburg, this place became a safe haven for soldiers that were being treated for wounds received during battle. Monsieur would go on to lead a colony out in Ohio with a little over 30 slaves, or enslaved people. And it was the first of its kind. And he would also start a church up where everybody could attend that church together. He was a unique, one-of-a-kind person. And this is just one of the many stops out here on the Civil War trails. And here in a second, I'm about to round the corner and go to another spot that's right behind here that's not even a part of the Civil War trails, because happy accidents happen. When you pass by a historical spot on the way to a Civil War trail sign, I call those happy accidents. So we're going to go check out what historic piece of property lies just behind this house here at the Conway house. Out here in Falmouth at that Civil War trail stop that we went to, we passed what I like to call happy accidents. These are places that aren't often visited and are not really on the trail site, and they're not really marked by much unless you're looking for specific things like Virginia historic landmarks. This is the Union Church behind me. That's what it was called. And inside the church that used to exist here, because that's only the front-facing portion of it, only a portion of this church was able to be saved. The 7th Michigan had about 3 companies of soldiers that actually winter quartered in here after being defeated at the Battle of Fredericksburg. There was also a burial detail that happened out here, and there's a depiction of that burial detail of those Union soldiers that had been buried out here. It was pretty telling, and I'll read that off for you. I'm going to read an account from former slave John Washington that he wrote about a burial that took place out here for Union soldiers. The soldiers had a sad duty to perform. The funeral was one of the most solemn and impressive I had ever witnessed in my life before. Their company was dismounted and drawn up in lines around the 7 new graves which had been dug side by side. The old family burying ground wherein these new made graves had been dug contained the bones of some of the oldest and most wealthy of the early settlers of Falmouth. On some of the tombstones could be dimly traced the birthplaces of some in England, Scotland, and Wales, as well as Ireland, and amidst grand old tombs and vaults surrounded by noble cedars through which the April wind seemed to moan low dirges, there they was now about to deposit the remains of what the rebels was pleased to term the low-born Yankee. So like we said, the 7th Michigan was out here for a while, and they were doing picket duty out here at Falmouth on the river. But in the aftermath of the battle, those 3 companies set up the winter quarters. But on this sign here, it also details that in the spring of 1863, when the Army of the Potomac marched toward another major battle, Chancellorsville, Company B of the 7th Michigan remained at the church on picket duty, and a secret submarine telegraph was discovered in the Conway house below. Concealed under the river, the device was used to pass messages about troop movements and other military information to the Confederates in Fredericksburg. So, that feel-good story that we just talked about that came from the sign that talked about Mr. Conway and him having a house down here, and the house belonging to him is true, but also there's another purpose in that house. It looks like that house was also a house for spies. So, duality purpose, really. The soldiers probably had a real good reason to believe that somebody shot from that house and tried to kill him. If they burned the house down, they probably would have been justified. You try to shoot and kill me, I'm going to burn your house down too. I'm out here at another Civil War trail stop called the White Oak Church stop. We're going to try to cross the road here and take a look at this place and not get run over by a car. But it's a real neat place to be. There's a lot of history here at this location. In 1862 and 1863, this small little church actually served as a field hospital. And it was dead center of probably the largest town in the area because it became a campground for American Civil War soldiers, Union soldiers specifically. 20,000 soldiers camped in and around the area here. And on the grounds of this church, 55 soldiers were actually buried out here. And then later, those soldiers were reinterred in a proper burial ground for them at a national cemetery. But this is one of those small wayside stops along the way where there's a sign for the Civil War trails out here, and according to the building where the trail sign was, it says White Oak Civil War Museum and Stafford Research Center. Used to be something there. Now it's marked as private property. The windows are boarded up, and I'm pretty sure that building, it looks like it used to be a church at one point in time, but it is no longer a church. And on the grounds of this property here, there are what looks like a couple of graves that are poorly identified out here. One that says Henry Ann Jones, 1855 to 1940, and the other one just has a small portion of the marker left at the head of it. So we're going to walk around this place and see what it looks like. So, you come out to these places and happy accidents happen all the time. I'm passing by here, and I'm going to White Oak Church and filming that location right over there, and a car pulls up, and I think that I might be in trouble. And the gentleman that steps out says that he's one of the caretakers of the church, and one of the members that ensures that he's like a trustee of the church and the historic grounds out here. And he points me in the direction of where a couple of Union soldiers are still buried out here, and where some Confederate soldiers are buried. And then he talks to me and tells me that he'd be happy to take me for a tour inside this church one day, and gave me his contact number. So things like that happen out here on the trails. Civil War trails signs really point you in a real good direction to check out history, but also sometimes you get a little bit more than you bargained for, and it was really nice of David to do that. So hopefully here pretty soon we're going to come back to this area and take a real tour of that White Oak Church and get a little bit more information about it, because he seems to know an awful lot about the history out here at White Oak Church. One of our stops is this United Methodist Church here, the Zion United Methodist Church. This is a Civil War trail stop out here. There is a sign for you to read about the information. Read the information about the church, that is. And this church, just like any other church in the 1800s, except for the fact that in 1864, the Union Army and the Confederate Army both passed through here on these roads headed south. This church becomes a lookout point for the Confederate Army. There were Union soldiers in there at one point in time, and then eventually Confederate soldiers make their way into this church. Robert E. Lee and A.P. Hill ends up counseling together in this church. They come together and they talk about what they need to do. They have signalmen in the top of the church that are looking out with telescopes at the fields to see where the Union Army is. And then they determine what they want to do afterwards, and they move on, which eventually, from here in 1864, you know that they push south and they end up at Cold Harbor, where they have a massive battle down there. Also, if you note here on the side of the church, that white door. This is part of the ugly part of history. That white door was the entrance for the enslaved people to go to church here in this county. This is one of the small churches that are around the area. There were many of them, but this was one of the nicer churches out here. It was built in 1857. That church was incorporated for that reason, so that the enslaved members of this community could go through that door separate from the people that were enslaving them. Then after the war, it continues to be a stain on that church. That door is a place for freed members of this community that are African American to go through to go to church. So they still have a separate entrance, a separate place for them to enter, to praise God, and to be able to go to church, separate from the white members of this town. And that was part of many of the rules that were put in place after the American Civil War that would eventually become the Jim Crow laws. When you come out to these cemeteries, out of these stops along the way, especially these churches, you'll find veterans like Thomas Addison Harris behind me. Now, Thomas was a Confederate veteran, and he fought for the 9th Virginia Cavalry at the end of the war. And according to the information out here on the sign, he was also part of the 30th Infantry, but he re-upped to be in the 9th Virginia and continue the fight. The story goes that at one point in time, I think it was the Battle of Spotsylvania, there was a fire that was burning a house down, and inside the house there was a woman trapped in there along with 2 young girls. Harris was part of a crew that was picked to go in and rescue those people out of that house. He volunteered to do so when he didn't have to. He went in there and they rescued the women out of the house. He continued on with the war, and eventually he makes his way back here, where he's actually from, here in Spotsylvania, and he lives out the rest of his life here. And him and several other veterans are actually buried here in the cemetery at the Salient Methodist Church. Now, that also includes one gentleman out here that was with the United States Army at the time of the Civil War. He was with heavy artillery with New York. His story comes from Canada. He immigrated down from Canada, and he makes his way here just in time to be in the American Civil War. And now he's buried out here in Spotsylvania in this cemetery at the United Methodist Church. Another stop along the Civil War Trails route is right here, where Todd's Tavern used to be. Out here at this location, Grant would end up making a headquarters here as he decides to push his way south and try to get Lee's army out into the open, where he can take advantage of his numbers and his superiority. They make a pass through here. Grant ends up stretching out on the floor to sleep, and he hears some noise going on outside, and he doesn't exactly know what's going on, so he asks the soldiers, who are laughing and joking around, what's happening. and one of the soldiers remarks that the band outside struck up a tune called Out of the Wilderness. They found it funny. Well, Grant ends up leaving, and Hancock ends up staying here for some time afterwards. The cavalry comes up here, and Early comes up here. Early, seeing an opportunity, decides he's going to push in and try to fight. But when he gets here, he sees the fortifications that are around the area, and he decides, based on the superior numbers and the fortifications, it's probably not a good idea. Early decides to back off and head towards Spotsylvania, which was a good choice for him. He didn't have very many troops left. But the cavalry, on the other hand, comes out here, and they start a fight. They didn't win the fight out here, but what they did do was the entire way that the Union Army was trying to make their way to Spotsylvania Courthouse, they kept felling trees into the road. They kept harassing the cavalry. They kept harassing the infantry as they were going along. And all of this basically led to the Union Army being slowed down to the point that the Confederates were able to get there first, which was key. It was critical to that fight. If the Union gets there first, they take that junction, and Lee has no option. And maybe even the fight of Spotsylvania doesn't even take place. Fitzhugh Lee really caused a mess for the Union Army out here at Todd's Tavern. Dear Father, this is my last letter to you. I went into battle this evening as courier for General Heth. I've been struck by a piece of shell and my right shoulder is horribly mangled, and I know death is inevitable. I'm very weak, but I wrote to you because I know you would be delighted to read a word from your dying son. I know death is near, that I will die far from home and friends of my early youth. But I have friends here too, who are kind to me. My friend Fairfax will write you at my request and give you the particulars of my death. My grave will be marked, so that you may visit if you desire to do so, but it is optionary with you whether you let my remains rest here or in Mississippi. I would like to rest in the graveyard with my dear mother and brothers, but it's a matter of minor importance. Let us all try to reunite in heaven. I pray my God to forgive my sins, and I feel that his promises are true, that he will forgive and save me. Give my love to all my friends. My strength fails me. My horse and my equipments will be left for you. Again, a long farewell to you. May we meet in heaven. Your dying son, J.R. Montgomery. J.R. Montgomery wrote this letter to his father because he didn't want to be left in a place where his burial would be unknown to what was left of his family. And as you can tell by the somber words that he wrote, it was extremely sad that he would not be reunited in real life with his dad, that he would not lay to rest beside his mother, and that he would probably never return to Mississippi. And it was a real fear on both sides of those armies for those soldiers, because after all, they're people. They're human, every single one of them. And they are all afraid of not returning home, just like anybody would be today. Those men would march up and down these roads from county to county in one place after another, and they would see the bleached bones of soldiers on the sides of the streets, out in the woods, from one battlefield to another that they had already campaigned on and fought on. So they knew exactly what was in store for them if they were to pass away on one of these battlefields. Unfortunately, for neither side was there much care given to the fallen soldiers, because the armies had to move on. And many times, these soldiers' burials were left up to the citizens in the surrounding area. Soldiers would come out here, die, and sometimes lay in these woods for months, maybe even years, before somebody happened to cross their skeletal remains or their bodies, and then they would just bury them in the ground where they lay. And then sometimes there were burial details where hundreds, if not thousands, of soldiers would be lined up in long rows, a hole dug. They'd be piled in on top of each other with no discerning of who is who. And most of the times, it was almost impossible, because the bodies would be bloated, blackened. Most of these battles happened during the summer months. It did not take long for decomposition to set in. But it's letters that come out of this American Civil War like that really touch you, because you try to put yourself into the footsteps of these men that fought. You try to bring a human connection to it. They're not just historical figures. This isn't just a bunch of historical battles. These are real humans, really in one of the worst times in our country, fighting these battles at this war, and they're dying. They're dying by the thousands. And that's the cost of an American Civil War.